it's a sort of related thing. I just wanted to mention instantaneous current off measurements, which are used to identify the true pipe potential by correcting for the IR drop, the polarization resistance that you get because the soil isn't very conductive. And I think that was your last slide. And what happens is that you get a, when you switch the cathodic protection system off, you then get a drop in potential, and I'll show you what that looks like. So it looks a bit like this. Don't know whether it'll do. I need to try that. Don't need the details. The point is that you have your cathodic protection potential, whatever it is, switch the current off, you get an instantaneous drop. And that's related to the soil resistance. You then get a more gradual depolarizing, if you like, of the pipe, but that's not really of interest. The bit that they're interested in is what the instantaneous drop is, and that allows you to identify the pipe potential more accurately. So, although it's a slightly different thing from measuring polarization curves, the principle is the same. If you do a slow polarization curve, then there's plenty of time for the system to go to equilibrium. The currents are smaller, you get less IR drop. If you do a fast sweep, then you're further away from the equilibrium condition, the current's usually larger, and the error in the potentials from the true potential of the electrode to the measured potential enlarges. So there's a current theme between the two. Once you've got a reasonably sized current flowing, you get an IR drop. Okay. So that's the end of that little section. What I'm going to do now is move on to an entirely different exercise, and that all starts this little thing here. It's looking a bit dark. Let me go put light down. Try a light on it. Maybe that'll do it. Whoa. Yeah, that's not too bad. Whenever I'm going somewhere, I've usually got a camera with me, and I'm usually taking pictures, mainly of corrosion, but sometimes of other things. So this isn't anywhere near as exotic as Cape St. Vincent's. This is Berwick. Okay, the beach at Berwick. Actually, the beach you want to go to is Bamborough, but Berwick's quite nice as well. And this is a ship's boiler left on the beach. And as you can see, there's a substantial amount of marine life attached to this boiler, and that is inducing corrosion underneath the surface layer of bacteria and algae, and that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about biocorrosion, or microbially induced corrosion. So this type of corrosion has been around for a long time, but it was sort of officially recognised as a mode of corrosion in the early 1890s. What happens in moist environments where you can get build-up of bacteria on the surface, you can get sludges and slimes built up on the surface that enhance localized corrosion. So you get predominantly pitting enhanced by the bacteria. And as you might imagine, one of the mechanisms that occurs is that you've got your surface of your steel, you get a film build-up on the top, which is of the bacteria and organic matter, and you then have a possibility of getting oxygen differential. If there are holes in that film, you can get oxygen-rich areas and oxygen-depleted areas, and that will give you enhanced corrosion. The bacteria themselves, there are various ways of classifying them. One is by their chemical reaction, and so the three most common forms of bacteria are the sulfate reducing, the acid producing, the metal reducing, and we'll have a look briefly at all those three. So you do need a damp environment, moisture. This isn't going to happen in an exhaust flue or something like that. It's going to happen somewhere where you've got a suitable environment for the bacteria. So, sulfate reducing bacteria. Morning, gentlemen. Sorry. Okay. Are anaerobic. That is to say, they will operate in the absence of oxygen. So you've got your steel, the bacteria build up on the surface, quite often in lumps, little colonies, okay, rather than a continuous film to start with. And the sulfate reducing bacteria will produce from the steel iron sulfides. And that material will be inside, underneath the film of bacteria. So it's getting generated near the interface between the steel. And the potential of the iron sulfide is different from the potential of the steel. So you've got a opportunity for a further galvanic corrosion. So there is the iron sulfide is the cathode of the system, the steel is the anode of the system, and you'll get some further corrosion around the interface. And this is not dissimilar to the sort of thing that happens in ordinary steels where you've got sulfide inclusions. If you've got a steel that isn't very clean in its production, then it may have manganese sulfide inclusions in it. And what you find is there are areas where you begin to get pitting on the material if it's exposed to a solution. So cleaner steels have less inclusions in, so they have less sulfides and therefore less pitting susceptibility. So that's the sulfate reducing bacteria. The acid producing quite a big range of bacteria of different types. Some of them are anaerobic, don't like oxygen. Some of them are aerobic and require oxygen to survive. And some of them are even trickier and actually will live in both environments. They're quite happy to live with or without oxygen, facultatives. So they're quite tricky to get rid of. And they produce a range of acids. So one of the things that some of the bacteria do is they produce CO2 as a waste product from their multiplication. And of course, if you add that to water, then you'll end up with carbonic acid. And like all acids, that has a slight tendency to attack steel. Some of them aren't CO2 related, some of them are again related to sulfur species, and so you get sulfuric acid. H2SO4. So it depends a little bit on the bacteria and the availability of oxygen as to what happens. And then you also get some other acids, organic acids, which are just called carboxylic acids. Carboxylic acids, which are just organic acids, other than carbonic. So there's a bit of a range of products, as you'll see in a minute or two. Okay. So, sulfate reducing, acid producing, and then the third category is the metal reducing bacteria. And they fall into two categories depending on whether they're aerobic, require oxygen, or whether they're anaerobic and don't like oxygen. Yes, sir.
What are the temperature ranges?
You're going to see in a minute. Good question. And the bacteria tend to live in little habitats, quite often as what they call tubercles, little lumpy sort of dome-shaped structures on the surface, under which you've got some pitting occurring. So before you get a continuous film, you get these lumpy tubercles. Okay. What do you need to have a biofilm? Well, first of all, you need some moisture. That's most important. That can actually be fairly low level, or it might actually be in solution. But if it's a bulk solution, then you don't want too much movement, because the movement tends to wash off the tubercles. So preferably stagnant if you're trying to grow a biofilm, which of course most of the time we're trying to stop. They don't like it too acid. They don't like it too alkali. You know, it's a biological living material. Unfortunately, the pH range includes the sort of pHs you find in soil, which is somewhere between 5 and 7 usually, and also includes what you find in a marine environment, where the pH is about 8.3, something like that, as average for seawater. So they're happy in groundwaters, they're happy in seawater in terms of pH. Like all living, well, not all, most living creatures, they don't operate at high temperature, so they don't want to be above 40 centigrade because they get fried, and they don't like to be frozen at the bottom end. Okay, so somewhere between 0 and 40 centigrade typically. And I know there are exotic bacteria living next to subduction zones in the middle of the ocean and things like that, but they're exceptions. The bulk of what we see likes to be in that 0 to 40 centigrade range. They quite like to have a bit of raw material lying about. A bit of organic matter helps. Remember, they're trying to build a little habitat. And the thing that is unfortunate for us is they like cathodic potentials. For some unknown reason, they are attracted to cathodically polarized structures. Not sure why that is, really. Somebody will know, but they're sort of attracted to that environment. Okay. on your handout you've got this diagram. I don't expect you to remember it all. Can you prove that at all? Maybe about there. The complexity of the system is large, but this is intended to is a schematic of some of the common bacteria. So the idea is that you've got your metal down the bottom here, and then a biofilm on top of the metal. And the biofilm is a series of layers. So what they're saying is close to the metal, you've got anaerobic bacteria. In the middle of the film, you've got bacteria that don't mind whether there's oxygen there or not. And then on the top of the film, you've got aerobic bacteria that get oxygen from the bulk water. So this is a cross-section through a hypothetical film. And what I've labelled on there are some acid-producing bacteria. So these are aerobic, they're generating CO2, and the CO2 will go to produce organic acids. I've also labelled some sulfate-reducing bacteria. It actually has that down there. And on this slide they talk about iron-reducing bacteria, but that tends to be broadened out into metal-reducing bacteria down here. And you can see that depending on whether you're in an anaerobic situation or an aerobic situation, you'll either get iron 3 going to iron 2 or iron 2 going to iron 3. As I say, the system's very complicated. I don't expect you to remember any of the detail of the slide. It's just to indicate some of the things that go on, including fermentation processes producing alcohols, and a variety of sulfur species.
So that means that we have different corrosion processes competing against each other?
Yeah, the bacteria compete against each other. They like all bacteria, you know, they dream of world domination. They want their species to drive out all other species and be in charge of the whole film. So yeah, they are competing in that sense. I'll show you this as well, but you don't need the details. This is just a little a list of some of the industries in which they have found bacterial problems: chemical plant, power generation, offshore, pipeline, water treatment, and so on. It's all over the place, and sometimes it causes significant problems to quite sophisticated industries. So when bacteria begin to thrive in a system, quite often it blocks the filters on the circulating fluid, and that can stop the whole process. So you have quite a sophisticated industry brought to a halt because of bacteria. So I was show you that in passing. As I say, you don't need the details. This is another little slide. Again, you don't need the details, but I just thought it was nice for you to see. One of the things that you quite often get with these biofilms is a general rotten egg smell, a sulphide-y type smell. Okay, so what we've got here again is our metal surface, and then some a biofilm on top of it, and some profiles of what's happening in the biofilm. So this is distance from the surface of the metal upwards. If we look at pH in this particular biofilm, they found the pH through the biofilm was always about 5. Didn't change very much. If you look at the sulfide concentration, it changes quite significantly as you begin to climb up through the biofilm. So this is concentration of sulfide along the bottom here, and there's a lot more sulfide near the surface of the metal than there is higher up in the biofilm. And then the final plot is dissolved oxygen content, and that just shows that the oxygen content climbs significantly as you get out towards the top of the biofilm. And that's one profile from an experimental piece of work. So there's quite a difference in the conditions as you go through the biofilm. Your solution, if it's in equilibrium with air, will contain about 8 parts per million oxygen, and down in the biofilm several orders of magnitude less. So you go from aerobic to anaerobic as you go through the film. These are just some pits in material. So this is a plan view of the pit. This is a cross section showing how it's gone through the wall thickness of this oil pipe, and here's another bit of pitting on a coupon. So it has the effect of enhancing the localized pit formation. On your handout you've got this diagram which illustrates a cross-section of one of these tubercles. So they're a bit like igloos, and the bacteria are living together. So it's a what they call in biology a symbiotic relationship. That is to say, they join together to create this igloo, and the anaerobic ones live on the inside, the aerobic ones live on the outside. And you get a load of pitting underneath the tubercle. And that's a bit like the water droplet section that we looked at when we were talking about pitting. So you've got oxygen reduction, and you've got dissolution of the metal at the anode. Okay. So that's a tubercle. This is the same thing, really, just a slightly different drawing, and a little bit more biological information, different types of bacteria names. You don't need the details at all. It's just to reinforce the concept that this is an igloo. It has a wall. It might actually have a vent in it. It's not necessarily a perfect dome. And there are all sorts of things going on here, different bacteria doing different things. Sulfate reducing bacteria producing H2S, and so on. So you've got an ecosystem with different bacteria complementing each other, but also competing with each other. Another way to think about the bacteria is to think of classifying them by environment. And there are some generalizations in their properties if you do that. So the aerobic bacteria, because they're generating carbon dioxide and then alcohols and other carbon compounds, are able to provide some of the polymer walling, if you like, for the tubercle. And they're in the oxidizing business because they've got oxygen available, and they'll generate carboxylic acids and cause corrosion of metal if they get into contact. The anaerobic bacteria are more in the reduction of species exercise, and on your table we're talking about iron 3 going to iron 2. That's the addition of electrons. And there are various other, if you go to the books, you'll find people classifying bacteria in various ways and trying to improve the level of detail and level of understanding. But we're just trying to get a broad picture. Okay. How do we control MIC? Well, you can use biocides. Historically, copper was particularly good, and you remember when we were talking about putting copper sheets onto the Royal Navy frigates in the 1760s. Nowadays, you're not allowed to use significant amounts of copper. There are regulations against it, and some of the bacteria are resistant to copper up to about 2% in the environment, which is bad news as well. You know, some of them are getting more resistant. So there are more sophisticated biocides, but copper is the historical one and perhaps the most obvious one. Had a guy came in. Did I tell you my cathodic protection story? A guy came in. He said, "I've got this discovery. You know, I'm going to make a fortune out of this. You know, I just want to run it past you. You know, confidentially." You know, so he was all for signing a secrecy agreement. You know, and so I said, "Well, you'd have to give me an outline of what you do." He said, "I've got a yacht." He said, I found out how to keep the hull clean. He says, "I've got I put these copper anodes out in the water around the hull and power them up, and the hull just stays beautifully clean." So what he was doing was dumping large quantities of copper ions into the harbour water, which is highly illegal, and I had to go and switch it off and go away. You know, sort of, it just isn't allowed. There are regulations now to stop you using copper, which is a pity because it's very effective as a biocide. The tubercles, these little igloos with this symbiotic relationship of the aerobic and anaerobic bacteria, You can, of course, mechanically clean the surface and remove them, or remove the whole film if it's become a solid film, and that slows the process down, evens out the corrosion, if you like, because it's under the tubercles that you're getting these localized pitting attack. If you've got a closed loop system, some heat exchanger system or something, you then have the option to control the oxygen level in that loop. And you can switch from an aerated environment for a little while to a de-aerated environment for a little while, and so on. That's okay, but the trouble with bacteria is they tend to grow quite quickly and they breed quite fast. So you're always working against the reappearance of the bacteria. In some ways, particularly in closed loop system, if you can actually clean and sterilize the whole system, then you start from scratch again. You're maybe going to save a lot of time and energy in control. The thing that you can't do in a closed loop, but you can do elsewhere, if you can dry out the environment, if you can take the system to above 40 centigrade and let it dry out, that's going to kill everything. It's as good as anything.
Can we inject hot water?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, that would work. Okay. That's that bit. Okay. This is a slightly, it's a related thing. I just wanted to say that, of course, there are a load of bacteria in soils. They contain moisture, they've got organic matter, they've got trapped gases, so it's a nice environment for bacteria. So you've got your soil, probably a pipeline buried underneath the topsoil, and then there is what they call the water table. That is the height at which there is water in the system. So you've got a saturated soil saturated with water to a level. That's your water table, and that water table height changes depending on whether it's summer or winter, and it also depends on whether the soil is sandy or clay. So in a sandy soil, the water table may be in the order of 3 meters or so in depth from the topsoil to the water table. In a sandy condition, the water table is quite low, and also in hot environments. In a clay soil, the water table might be quite high. So you've got a situation where your pipe may or may not be experiencing times in the summer, perhaps when the water table's below its level, and in the winter when perhaps the water table's above its level. So that's one issue which you get, seasonal differences, taking you from aerobic conditions where the water table's below the pipe to anaerobic conditions where the water level's above the pipe. That's not to say there isn't a bit of moisture in the soil dotted about, which is enough to help the bacteria, but actually having a saturated soil level is changing. This would probably be hyphenated backfill. There's a problem when you bury pipes. It's a common problem. You dig a hole, and what you should really be doing is very carefully putting the topsoil to one side, putting the clay to another side, taking out the boulders, and then putting your pipe in and backfilling. And the trouble is, people sometimes get a bit carried away and they just dig a hole, pile everything up and put it back in again without thinking about the order of it. So you end up with a situation where your soil then has lumps of clay and then sandy bits, and then another lump of clay and sandy bits. And so poor backfill can then end up giving you oxygen differential along the pipe. So I've got a couple of images related to that. Again, you don't particularly need the details. These are two images. One just illustrating if you've got a length of pipe, the soil composition can well change as you go along the length, and when you get an interface between, say, a sandy soil that's going to be oxygen rich and a clay soil that is going to be low in oxygen, then you've got an oxygen differential, then you can get corrosion. So you've got to watch as you move along the length of the pipe that you're going into different soil structures. And then the other one is the backfill situation, where you've got lumps of clay that have just been randomly dumped back in the hole, and some of them are in contact with the pipe, and that gives you again an oxygen differential situation and enhanced attack. And there are all sorts of statistics come out about corrosion, but the estimate, at least in the UK, is that half of the corrosion problems of buried pipes are associated with MIC, associated with bacteria. And that's because we live in a nice moist environment, and there's plenty of opportunity for that sort of biological corrosion. I'll show you one more thing. Again, you don't need the details of this at all. I just thought I'd show it to you. This is just illustrating some environments that support microbial induced corrosion. The equilibria that you get in carbonates gives you pH around 8, and that's fine. The equilibria that you get with silicates, silicates of course are part of clays and also sand and so on, give you pHs around 6, which again is fine for microbial corrosion. And the top end of the clay is in cation exchange. So the soil is generally fine for microbial corrosion, and that's bad news for the buried pipeline. Okay, that finishes that section nicely. I'll see you next week. Thank you.
Would you leave? I think it's you have that's French shape.
Yeah.
So you have clay layer, sand layer. So if you put your pipeline under above the clay layer, do you do something? That's what it's originally.
If it's in the sand, it's going to stay drier, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, it's probably better
So it means like
because the clay's usually wet.
yeah. I mean you don't like dig the clay, disturb, you put it above the clay.
Yeah, so it's probably better.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would have thought so.
And regarding the mass papers, I checked when we talked last week. So yeah, I took one mass paper.
All right. Right, okay, I'll try and find out why they're not available. They should be. All the last 3 years should be available.
I checked the previous, when I checked previous, even there was no like at all.
Right, okay, I'll ask the admin why that is. Get them to sort it. Thank you.
Regarding the final period goals, you said the favorable environment is less than 40 degrees Celsius for the biodiversity.
Yeah, the bacteria all die if you heat them up too much. Yeah.
What is the optimum range of temperature for the biofilm? Is it higher temperature ever like around 40 degrees?
No, because your risk is that you're going to dry out the environment, and you don't want to do that. So they're better. They're better.
No more ambient
In 20, 25, they're probably quite happy. It's a balance between the kinetics, if you like, or the reproduction cycle of the bacteria, and making sure that they don't dry out. Because if they dry out, that does slow everything down a lot.
I have another question. So I found that like a marine environment in like the tropical areas like Southeast Asia, the accelerated corrosion compared to the
Yeah.
Is it because of MIC or?
Well, it's partially temperature at any rate, because corrosion rate accelerates a rough order. It's about double every 10 degrees centigrade rise in temperature. So it's partially kinetics. But there will also be some bacterial action as well.
Temperature accelerates the corroding cathode process.
I picked the wrong guy.
So it accelerates diffusion, and it accelerates. You see more activation energies for reactions and so on. I don't think it's mainly that, but I'm not saying MIC doesn't contribute, but
Main contribution.
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
No, 70.
I want to make a modeling that is including the corrosion pits shape, but I don't know which shape is the
Obviously
best
not.
for corroded.
Well, pits change shape as they grow.
Yeah, so But when it comes
That's
to
what
modeling
we
the
make it,
corrosion
but that
peaks,
works for both.
So you need to look in.
Yeah.
He has an easy life and you have a good
outside,
It's perfect.
Okay, you need to go into the literature. There's lots of papers about shapes of
yeah,
pits,
right. So
but they change shape with time.
Yeah.
Done it before. How could
So
it not
they,
be original? That's why I was smart.
So they'll start off shallow,
Yeah.
and then they'll become hemispherical.